Hello and welcome back to my 10 favorite people. Hope you're doing well. I'm incredibly excited for today's video because we're finally seeing some action from Bitcoin this week. But what I'm not seeing enough people discussing is that even in the years where Bitcoin went down in Q4, it still always rallied in October. And it's really November that sets the trend. And if we take a look at all of the Q4s over the past 10 years or so, October was almost always green, and if November was green as well, we'd go green into December. Same thing in 2016, same thing in 2017, and then in 2018 we had a slightly green October, but November we rolled over aggressively. Same thing in 2019, slightly green October, rolled over in November. 2020 was just up in all 3 months, October, November, and December. And then in 2021, up in October, down in November, down in December. Similar in 2022, up in October, down in November, flat in December. And then most recently in 2023, up in October and up in November. And that's what set the trend for Bitcoin to go higher. So October is almost always green, which is great, but it's really November where we're going to find out what's in store for Q4 and likely the beginning of 2025. Now, in my last video, we said things were looking pretty decent in the short term because Bitcoin was holding above its 20-week moving average and could be confirming a higher low compared to the low we set in late August. And we saw the dollar index was struggling at resistance, and perhaps we could see it roll over sometime soon, but this hasn't really happened yet. And we know that Bitcoin's past two mania phases required those large drops in the US dollar index, and that's what sent Bitcoin skyrocketing higher. And it's also what resulted in those incredible alt seasons in 2017 and 2021, but we haven't seen that start quite yet. And we're actually still seeing global liquidity going down, even though Bitcoin has been able to go a little bit higher this week. And that brings up the question of what's actually causing this upward momentum for Bitcoin in the short term. And it's very clear to me that what's causing it is Trump pulling away on Polymarket here. And yes, I know there's a ton of people that think Polymarket isn't reliable, but almost everybody in the crypto space almost exclusively looks at Polymarket for their election odds. And this is really the only site that I see quoted and shared on Twitter, which we know is where so much of the Bitcoin discussion happens. So really whatever Polymarket says is what most people that are trading this asset class are going to believe. So whether you think Polymarket is right or wrong, if it has Trump leading by 15%, that's something that Bitcoin traders are going to be making decisions off of. And we've been seeing Bitcoin doing very well recently, ever since about the beginning of September, and that's roughly when Trump has started slowly pulling away on Polymarket. And although we see Bitcoin reacting to Trump's lead in the polls in the short term, I do agree with the BlackRock CEO Larry Fink that it doesn't matter in the medium to long term because Bitcoin's main use case is as a currency debasement hedge. And no matter which party we've seen in office, that trend has only continued. And we've seen Bitcoin have incredible bull market rallies, whether there was a Democrat or Republican sitting as the US president. And this is even more solidified today now that we have US publicly traded corporations like MicroStrategy and Tesla holding Bitcoin on their balance sheets. But we also have multi-trillion-dollar asset managers like Fidelity and BlackRock that are pitching and offering these Bitcoin spot ETFs to their clients. So I do think that Bitcoin is pretty safe from regulatory scrutiny. And yes, the market is going to be very excited about Trump's lead in the short term, but I don't think it matters in the medium to long term for Bitcoin. But what does matter is what we've seen from global liquidity, and this is almost entirely led by the Fed and whether they're doing QT or QE and adding to their balance sheet or reducing it. So far, they have still been reducing it, even though they have started cutting rates. And we've seen what's happened to markets in previous cycles when the Fed cut rates but did not start doing QE quick enough So that's probably the most important thing I'm watching for over the next few months. Yes, it's great that the Fed has started cutting rates, but we can't get that excited about a real mania phase for Bitcoin until we see the Federal Reserve go back to QE and back to expanding its balance sheet. And that's probably going to be the main driver of what Bitcoin cycle scenario we end up having. I think it's very possible that if we do get a Trump win, that would end up bringing a lot of excitement to this space in the short term, and maybe that's what results in this shortened cycle scenario where Bitcoin gets a nice breakout and rally, but isn't able to go that high and go to everybody's price targets like $150,000 or $200,000 Bitcoin without QE backing it. But if instead we end up having a red November and it ends up taking a lot longer for this market to break out, maybe Bitcoin puts in another low and tests those low 40,000s and spends a couple more months chopping around going sideways until finally the Fed starts doing QE for whatever reason. And that's what really sends Bitcoin skyrocketing higher. And then perhaps the failed cycle scenario is the scenario where we end up having a terrible recession. The Fed takes way too long to start QE and Bitcoin just goes a lot lower than most people are ready for. Now, I still think the normal cycle and the shortened cycle are way more likely than the failed cycle in red here, but that's why we monitor what the Fed is doing with their balance sheet so closely, and that's why we also keep such a close eye on global liquidity, because Bitcoin's past two huge rallies have coincided with huge surges in global liquidity, and it makes sense that if we're going to see a huge increase in the currency that's circulating globally, that would put immense upward pressure on Bitcoin. But as of right now, we haven't seen that quite yet, and this short-term excitement seems to be way more election driven. Now, the good news is traditional markets are still doing really well with the S&P 500 continuing to grind higher, and it would be absolutely great if Bitcoin could just stop chopping around and follow along, because we very clearly have the S&P 500 in price discovery here, and Bitcoin is consolidating in a very clear large bull flag here, but nobody knows if it's going to break out soon like we have mapped out in our shortened cycle scenario, or if it's going to go and test the lows one more time and then a breakout maybe early Q1 of 2025 like we have mapped out in the normal cycle scenario. But all we can do is monitor it going forward, and we really want the S&P 500 to remain strong if Bitcoin is eventually gonna have that incredible rally. Another solid argument for why Bitcoin might not be ready to break out here is we did see the largest spot Bitcoin ETFs inflow since about June. And if we look at the inflow history and look at when that last major inflow was on about June 3rd, and we look at where Bitcoin's price was when that inflow happened, we've tended to see these large inflow spikes when everybody starts piling in at local highs. And now we have this recent inflow of 8.4 thousand Bitcoin, and that's coming in right here on this large wick that we saw this morning. And I saw a lot of FOMO and excitement on Twitter as this was happening. So are we going to see that repeated trend of these very large inflows coming in at local highs for Bitcoin, and it results in the market needing to cool off a little bit once everybody piles into those ETFs, and especially if a lot of investors start piling in with leverage. We also start to see articles like this one popping up whenever Bitcoin is near a local high and sentiment is starting to get overextended. Different this time, question mark. Bitcoin RSI says 233K possible in 2025. And maybe it is. I mean, nothing is impossible, but the likelihood of that happening, especially when we're only trading at 60,000, you tend to see these things get spread a lot more often, and you tend to see these headlines a lot more commonly at local highs versus local lows. But if we zoom out, still very clearly in the fair value region here for Bitcoin. If you're buying here on a multi-year investment time frame, probably not a terrible place to buy. But for me, I'm only interested in buying below 50,000, and I am really not interested in buying above 70,000. But for now, we're still chopping around in this fair value range, but I do think November is going to pull us out of it. The real question is it going to be a breakout to the upside, and that's what's going to set our trend, or is November going to take us below 50K because the Fed has not gone back to QE. But if you are investing for the long term and keeping up with Bitcoin and crypto content right now when search volumes are at a yearly low, it's likely that these are going to be decent prices when we look back in 1 to 2 years. So at least you're not buying at the peak mania when we have Bitcoin search volume super high and everybody piling into Bitcoin and mainstream media is only talking about Bitcoin. So as of right now, it does seem like a decent time to accumulate for those of us that want to, if we look at the fact that search volume is so low. And as of right now, we're seeing way more attention being taken up by things like AI and Nvidia and meme coins, and nobody really cares about Bitcoin when it comes to Google search volume. As for macro, we are still seeing a slow and steady increase on Truflation's inflation index, now at 2.2%. And again, as long as this is below 3%, nothing really to worry about, but it has been slowly working its way higher week after week, and we could perhaps see a resurgence of inflation narrative pick up sometime early in 2025, and that could end up having a huge impact on markets. So we'll continue monitoring this closely because Truflation tends to be a great leading indicator for what we end up seeing on CPI and core CPI. And if we take a look at the labor market, initial jobless claims is going to get updated on Thursday. So we're going to see if the last print was just caused by the hurricane in Florida, or if this is actually the labor market weakening significantly. So we'll see what we end up getting from Thursday's print there. And that's going to be a great leading indicator for what we can expect from the unemployment rate. And as for GDP, still well above 3%, still quite positive, and still looks good if we look at the quarter over quarter number. So nothing really to worry about in terms of recessions over the next few weeks or few months, but this is something we'll continue monitoring because this could change by mid-2025. As for the federal government, nothing has changed here. We're still waiting on this to update now that we're officially in the fiscal year of 2025, which started on October 1st. But we're still seeing the federal government running these huge deficits, and the debt is likely only going to increase over the next few years. And as that national debt gets increased, eventually it gets monetized, it devalues the fiat currency and puts upward pressure on our risk assets. And I don't think that's a trend that's going away anytime soon. And this is why we remain bullish the S&P 500 in the long term, and we also remain bullish Bitcoin in the long term. So we'll see what happens with this election. We're approaching just 20 days away, and I expect a lot of volatility as we get close to it and even in the week or two after it. And I do believe this is the main narrative impacting markets right now, and it's not going to be until after the election when more important longer term trends like global liquidity start to impact Bitcoin a little more. But anyway, let me know what you expect. Is it going to be the shortened cycle scenario where Bitcoin has an earlier breakout, or will it be the normal cycle scenario where Bitcoin spends a lot longer consolidating and we don't enter price discovery until perhaps January of 2025? And I know there's still a lot of you that believe in the failed cycle scenario. We're not really going to know about that for sure until we see what happens with Bitcoin if we do revisit that 200-week moving average. But as always, we'll wait and see what happens. And thank you so much for the support on the recent videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.